Welcome to the Generative Edge, the podcast that keeps you up to date with the latest news and events in the world of generative AI. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a consultant at Deloitte Central Europe.
I'm Brandon, and I'm the Natural Language Processing and Generative AI Practice Lead for Deloitte Central Europe.
And we've got a special episode for you guys today. We have been asking since the beginning of this podcast for you to send in your questions so that we can answer them in episodes. And we've gotten a lot of, let's say, repeating questions, similar questions. So we figured we should just take some time to address them.
Absolutely.
And we're going to answer them. So let's call this our Mailbag special episode for today.
Merry Christmas.
We're basically just going to take a look at all of your questions that you've sent to us and give you our best answers as to how to solve them or what's relevant for you. So I'm going to start off with maybe a slightly controversial question, depending on how you answer it, Brandon.
I love this.
So the first question, somebody asked if we could recommend a certified course for generative AI. So I don't know if this is in our official capacity as podcast producers or Deloitte employees or whatever. So obviously, what is your take on certified courses?
Okay, from personal experience, I would say it's probably not worth paying for a course. Don't do it.
There's the controversial part. There you go.
And I'm also a hiring manager, right? So I look for people who have specific skills, and sometimes we look for certifications in certain areas. So like a certification in like, I don't know, Python development or something might be useful. Actually, I take that back. Even certification in software engineering is usually not what we look for.
Okay.
It's better to have experience, right? Or like projects that you've actually worked on and code that you can show that you've actually done something. Now, I know not everybody's doing coding. You don't have to be certified in coding to like get a coding job or something. And you don't have to do coding to do generative AI. In this case, if you're doing generative AI like as part of your daily work routine, or you just use it to summarize stuff, certification is going a step too far, I think. And the learning materials that are available, they're all over the place. It's really difficult to figure out whether it was like quality work or not. And I would recommend taking some of the free courses that are available from like some of the cloud providers. So definitely AWS, GCP has some, Microsoft has some. There are also some like on Hugging Face, which is like a typical place where people put their language models. There's just so much free content out there and YouTube tutorials. But getting a certification is like maybe a step too far.
I think it's a good distinction that you're making here, because I think there's like maybe the more businessy folks that want to demonstrate that they know something about generative AI versus technicians who are saying like, I know how to build these solutions, right? So I think what you're saying, especially those cloud ones, like I know AWS has them because I'm taking one right now. So I think those types of certifications are good just as like a show, a badge or something that you're like, hey, I know what I'm talking about, especially in like a more businessy context. Again, you're the tech expert here, so I think some of those technical
ones. No, that's a super good point, actually. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like certifications for like network security and stuff, because it's like a specific kind of work. With generative AI, it's more like it's just a tool that you use for different ends, and there's no governing body on generative AI skills, right? So there's nobody that's saying, oh, this certification has to, adhere to certain quality restrictions, and so a certification means essentially nothing. But what you said, like skill badges and these kinds of things, showing that you've completed modules, that's important. But actually paying for certification, no. Please don't.
Save your money, folks.
Exactly.
If not, try to get your company to pay for it. So I was gonna say, and this I think actually connects with the like businessy side of things. So we have another question here. Actually, we got a couple of these in different versions. So when we're talking about generative AI and being able to speak about it, what it can do, especially like to clients, things like that. The question is, what specific tasks within business functions can be automated or streamlined using GenAI? So this is a big question, but at the same time, I think there are maybe like pockets of things that GenAI is really good at for business cases. So what are some of those?
Probably summarization, taking meeting notes, restructuring text. So if you're taking notes and they're like all over the place, which is kind of how I take notes.
Same, don't worry.
I used to spend a lot of time like restructuring my notes and putting it into bullet points and rewriting it for different presentations and that kind of thing. That's the sort of thing that you can do really easily with generative AI. You already have the information written down, or you've expressed it in an audio file or something, and you just want to have it down in text in some certain format and maybe change that format multiple times. So yeah, instead of doing the rewriting yourself, put it into a generative model. You don't really need to worry about hallucinations in that case, as long as you tell the model not to like make up information. Just say, I want to restructure, I want bullet points, I want paragraphs, that kind of thing. Other stuff would be, obviously coding, but only really basic things. Like don't use it for entire software modules. But if you want to like, code one single function that multiplies numbers together, that's something that you can do super easy. Or Excel macros, that kind of thing.
Oh, we got a couple of questions about that actually, so I'm glad you brought that up. I think this actually, so what you're talking about right now, and I think this is kind of shorthand that at least we use on this podcast, when we're talking about generative AI, it's basically our way of saying like text models.
Yeah.
So I know that there are other types of models, and I'm sure we've hinted at this on various episodes of the podcast. For example, we had a question that was asking like if we have like a PowerPoint formatted file with text and you want GPT, let's just say, to design it in a specific way, colors, text format, etc. Is that possible? Probably not with a text model, but there might be other types of models that can do something like that.
Yeah. So I guess also when we say generative AI, as we've said in previous episodes, usually those models are supported by other pieces of software.
Right.
So like the model itself isn't going to generate PowerPoint slides, but the model is probably part of a product that's, developed by some group of developers or by a company or by a cloud provider. And it has a whole suite of capabilities, let's say. So for PowerPoint, if we just imagine like making a PowerPoint, you have to move text around, you make text boxes, you organize all of your content, you write the text obviously, but you also put in images and sometimes you make transitions. All of those things are different things that a single model won't be able to do.
Right.
But if you're using a product that's integrated into whatever, program you're using, like PowerPoint or something like that, then that would be handled by whatever product is being offered. Microsoft 365 Copilot does have those features, so and they're integrated into PowerPoint. So if you're using PowerPoint and you have access to 365 Copilot and you don't want to do all of that work, the model plus all of the supporting software can help redesign that slide, organize your content, write the text, that sort of thing. But the model itself isn't going to do everything.
Yeah, I think this is, and I know we've talked about this before on the pod, but I think this is like the distinguishing factor between when we're talking just about the large language model that is like the engine that's powering all these things versus the software and like the user interface that normal folks like us see. It's so many things under the hood that are actually happening, but we're the ones as users just saying, can you fix my PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's it. And it's magically done at that
and
point.
What percentage of the time are you using audio models, for example?
Me personally, probably never. But I think that's a good point because I think we did get a lot of questions that were like, oh, can ChatGPT do this? Or can this particular model do that?
Yeah.
And of course, we want to answer those on a case-by-case basis. Depends on where you're accessing it from. If it's like something that's work compliant versus a public product that anyone can use. Obviously, there's restrictions, but I think this is an important point that most of these products have
text.
Are text and then also have other software that are supporting it.
Exactly.
So not things that the normal user has to worry about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great. So to that point, there were definitely a lot of questions like, can I generate pictures? Can this model read documents and extract information? Can we upload our own documents? So like, what are some of the, let's say, common use cases there? I know we've already just talked about like text summarization, things like that. But when you're actually uploading a document, can you extract information from it? Like, what are some of the things that these models can do there.
Yeah, that's a really, really typical use case. So if you have like a big PowerPoint presentation or a PDF or something, like a scientific report, you want to ask questions about it or summarize it, that's like super typical use case, very easy to do with most commercially available products. If you're a developer and you're just sitting there with a model, it's actually going to be more difficult to like upload a document because you have to build out that entire pipeline. But fortunately, most of the commercially available products, ChatGPT, Bedrock, whatever, they have little UI interfaces. You can literally just upload your files. Everything else is handled under the hood.
So again, what can it do? What can it not do? Again, it's going to depend on the product, what you're using. But we did get a lot of questions about internet search capability.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about that for a second. So is that something, okay, let's just use ChatGPT as the example because, of course, that's the most commonly known and used product right now. So something like ChatGPT, is that connected to the internet? Is that something that users should be wary of? Like, obviously, I know you're not a representative of ChatGPT, but like, is that something that folks should be considering? Is that something that it can do?
Yeah, this space has changed drastically over the past year because I remember like when we were on our first episode, none of the commercially available products like ChatGPT, Bedrock, or whatever had integration with any search engine or with the internet. That has actually changed. So recently, like ChatGPT, for instance, if you just go to the demo ChatGPT, it doesn't have access to the internet. It cannot search, and it still only has like a knowledge cutoff of like October 2023 as of today. But if you log in with an account and you have a paid account, you can actually interact with those products, with like the GPT products, and that does have integration with some search engines.
Oh, that's interesting.
Google has announced different partnerships with like a few of these different large language model based chatbots and have given them access to the search engine. So yeah, it is depending on a case by case basis. But yes, a lot of these products now are connected with the internet. Now, whether you should trust the outputs of those. So, anytime that you do a Google search or do a Baidu search or whatever, and you get information, you still have to take it with a grain of salt. These models do not have the same level of critical thinking capability that people do. And so even if you do have access to a search engine, it doesn't actually mean that the information coming out is correct. And so always be wary. Always check the sources that information came from. Make sure that they're trustworthy sources. And this is no exception. A model is not going to be able to critically think about which sources it should take information from. It's just going to take a look at the top maybe 5 or 10 results and then base all of its responses on that text. So always be careful.
I was going to say this
generate responsibly.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say this is an interesting point, though. So, for example, we have a Deloitte compliant GPT model that we can use, like it's our own system, all that kind of stuff. So, for example, in this particular product, it does not connect to the internet, but there is an option to upload a document, and I've noticed when I've used it that it, quote unquote, cites sources.
Oh, yeah.
So is that something that's like a common feature across a lot of these models and products?
If it's not, it should be.
Okay. Love that. Yeah.
There's two reasons for that. In a previous episode, we talked about grounding, which is where you expect an answer from a generative model and you have to ground its response. That's the word that we use in the field, where all of the context for the question that it's answering is given within whatever you've actually sent it, either in a document or in actual text. If you don't ground the response, then you might get a hallucination or what we call unfaithful generation of text based on the context that you've sent. And citing sources or forcing the model to cite its sources actually increases the faithfulness with which it generates information based on that context. So if you say, look, here's a document that I'm going to give you, answer it, and provide me the exact details of like which page it came from, then the information is measurably more accurate than it would be if you didn't include those citations. And I think that's super important to do. If you're listening to this podcast and you've built a product that doesn't cite sources, please introduce that feature because it's super important.
I was going to say, and contact Brandon if you need help with that.
Yeah.
No, but I agree because this is something we've talked about, hallucinations being a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
Like we've talked about this on the pod. So the idea that this feature is available and could be, let's say, easily implemented in these solutions, and people are not doing it, that just seems like an easy win.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, guys, you know who to call. So, speaking of, there are GPT models or products that folks are using that you can upload documents. Are there any limitations people should be wary of when it comes to those documents, obviously, other than confidentiality and things, being accessed by big corporations, this and that? Is there any limitation to like the size of the file or like how expensive it is to run these things? Like, is there anything there with document uploads?
Yeah. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it does depend on the case.
Of course,
So on a case-by-case basis, it changes. Some models are only capable of taking in like a few pages of information, whereas others are capable of taking in 1,000 pages or even more of information. But generally, the more information that you send, the less likely it is that you're going to get good responses unless, without getting into too many technical details, when you upload a lot of information, you basically have to convert all of those pages into like a search database. If the product that you're using doesn't do that and it just takes like all of the text at face value, then there's a much stricter limitation on how much information you can actually put into it. So like you can upload 1,000 pages, but it'll say, you know what, I can only look at the first 700 or something like that. Whereas other products really do have all of that under the hood. You like upload as many documents as you want and it creates a giant search database, what we call a RAG system, a retrieval augmented generative system. Where it can recall specific pieces of that context by searching based on whatever you've asked it to bring up like the relevant passages, and then it generates responses there. So they have these like self-limiting they have these ways of like self-limiting what information it's actually looking at. Of course, this comes with caveats because whenever it tries to bring up relevant contexts, it then determines that, there are irrelevant contexts, which are done in an automated way, meaning that it might lose context that you thought was important or that you wanted it to include in its response, but wasn't measured relevant by the search engine that the company or the product actually uses. So it may miss details.
Yeah. This RAG systems, like I know this is kind of like the common use case for like chatbots and things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think as people get more practical, tangible experience with these types of chatbots, like that's hopefully citing sources, uploading documents, all this thing, they become the norm at that point. So let's, fingers crossed that would be nice.
I would also say, the way that they measure the quality of those models that have really long context windows. So like, I mean, there are some models now that can accept up to like 1 million tokens at a time. That's like so many hundreds of pages of information. And the way that they measure quality of these is usually by what we call a needle in a haystack search, which is, here's a giant book. It's all about how cars work. But then in the middle on page, 520, I'm going to have one sentence that doesn't fit. And it's like, I really like to eat pizza on Tuesdays or something really crazy. And then they ask the model, okay, what is the out of context sentence in all of this, in all the text that I've sent you? And it'll say, oh, well, that you want to eat pizza on Tuesday. It's great. Okay, so that's our measurement of success, this needle in a haystack. That is a very different test from getting 1,000 pages of information and saying, write an essay.
Yeah, okay.
Or put this information together in a way that makes sense for some specific stakeholder. Like that task requires a lot more work than just simply identifying one sentence that's out of place.
Yeah. But that makes, needle in a haystack is usually difficult anyway.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, last question here. We had a few different questions about language capabilities. So I'm assuming this is going back to text models and maybe voice as well. English obviously is like the primary language feature. A lot of these solutions are based in the U.S. and are developed in the U.S. Kind of makes sense. Lingua franca, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So are there limitations with various languages or other languages in models? So is this like a universal problem issue thing people are considering, or is it just depending on the product and the company?
It does somewhat depend on the product or the company, depending on the language the language data that they have access to. So if a model has never seen text in French, it's not going to be able to generate text in French. The really big ones like GPT, the models available at Bedrock or Claude, they're generally trained on what we call high resource languages. Those are ones that have lots and lots of training data available. Tons of people are writing on the internet in these languages like English, Spanish, Arabic, French, Chinese. And so it's much easier to train models that model those languages appropriately. So it's really easy to have models that can understand those languages effectively and then generate text in those languages. There are then what we call low resource languages, which are going to be, they have much fewer speakers. There's less readily available data on them. And so it's more difficult to train models on those languages because the models are like data hungry. You need a lot of data for a model to like accurately represent that language. So, recently we've tested it in like Albanian and Polish and a couple of other languages where you would expect it to have lower performance. And it is indeed the case that these models, if they're multilingual and have seen Albanian, for example, it can generate text in Albanian, but it's not going to look natural and it won't look quite as high quality as if you were doing it in English, which also means that if you're trying to do one task in English, you will get different results if you were trying to do exactly the same task in Albanian or some other low resource language. So just because it understands and can do a task in English or Spanish does not mean that it can actually do the same thing in another language, especially if it's one of those low resource languages.
Is this a good platform to say that we should have more diverse engineers and experiences to make sure that, these models can perform some of these lower resource. I mean, I understand like it's pulling information from various sources, but is this a case for like having more diversity in the tech space?
I think absolutely. But, the problem is that there's not as much of a commercial pull, right? So there are more than 7,000 languages spoken that we know of in the entire world. There were much more before the age of the internet and the radio, but now languages are going extinct like very rapidly. And because there are so many different languages, a lot of those actually lack writing systems. There are some languages that don't have any writing system whatsoever, and they are only spoken.
That's cool.
It's very cool. So actually, like when I was in university, one of the things that I really wanted to do was go somewhere and help document a language so that even if it went extinct, we would at least have the information readily available to actually like for people to learn those languages. But it's so hard to do. And it's so expensive. So we know that these models will never be, they're not going to speak all human languages. There will always be languages that are either difficult or impossible to model just because there isn't enough information about them. And that's pretty sad.
Well, what a lovely note to end on.
Sorry.
But I think so this type of episode where we're just answering your questions, I think the questions that we got were really interesting and varied, and I know we didn't get to all of them. But I think things like this are really important. Like we want to bust the myths. We want to give you as relevant and factual information about this space because, as we noted today, it changes so rapidly. So I hope we get to do a couple of these in the future.
I like this. Let's do it again. For sure.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for listening to The Generative Edge, a Deloitte Central Europe and AWS production. Your hosts are Brandon Eichner, Vyasaraj Kulkarni, and Donovan Spronk. Our show is executive produced by Stephanie Cohen, Vanch Luthra, Ian Masters, and the Deloitte studio in Prague. Head writers are Stephanie Cohen and Brandon Eichner. Our sound and audio engineer is Wojtek Krasa, who also serves as our editor and videographer. Michal Trusina is our graphic designer. Our marketing and social media managed by Stephanie Cohen and the Deloitte studio in Prague. And our theme song was written and produced by Jakub Flaszek. Don't forget to rate and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.